the job description of independent film writer is a very small one. The independent film wants a writer-director. They think first of the director and second is the writer. And so if you're a writer and you don't want to direct, you're sort of forced to try to work more inside the studio system, and then you're writing not what you want to be writing. And it's a very bad conundrum, you know. And I was once on a panel like this of writers and the subject of directing your own stuff, and somebody who I love very much, Doug McGrath, said, if you really believe in your work, then you have to want to direct it, because nobody else can direct it like you can. And I said, you know, Doug, respectfully, my whole reason for being a writer is in conflict with being a director. And that is to have as little contact with material reality as possible.
I think it's a bit sad that that screenwriters are obliged to direct their own project. You know, it's in France. It's very difficult. Maybe we are maybe 50 real screenwriters who can live and work regularly on the year, and all the others are obliged to become director or to write books if they don't want to become crazy or nervous breakdown or something like that.
I think we have some writers who really just write the script, they get hired for the script, and then the producer's looking for a famous director to make it. This happens too, but the normal way is just as Caroline Link or even Florian Henkel von Donnersmarck, the both Oscar award-winning German films. They wrote the scripts themselves, and then they went on as directors.
What's going on now is that the guilds have come up with new lower budget agreements, so that it's possible to work under a guild agreement for a figure much, much lower than they used to, if there's a low enough budget in the film. Because there are so many, I mean, the budgets, you know, films are getting made at incredibly low prices now. And writers might want to work in them, but they still might want some level of guild protections and some level of minimums, even though they're much lower minimums. I currently am working under a low budget guild work for hire, which is a new thing. A few years ago we had the thing called the low budget agreement, which meant you could sell a script for a low budget film for a lower figure than for a high budget film. But it wasn't possible to be hired to write a script at anything below the basic high budget minimum. That's now different, and you can get paid, take my word for it, like peanuts, like nothing. But it can be a guild agreement, and if, you know, the budget goes higher than that's proposed, then I mean, I think a lot. I don't know. It's an experimental program, and we have to see if it's really a good idea or not. Clearly, to my mind, there are a lot of producers who are trying to get non-low budget films developed with the understanding that if they get a sale, they can then pay the difference, but they've risked less in terms of getting the script. I see that quite a bit, and they say, oh yeah, we're going to make this film for $2 million. And you know they're not going to make the film for $2 million. But if they can't make the film at all, they've only paid you for a low budget script. And it's not great, but on the other hand, if you don't, what I like about it is it allowed me to write a couple of scripts that I really wanted to write. There were passion projects for me that I simply would not have been able to write as a guild writer, because I knew they weren't going to be able to raise money on them up front.
I think for all of us, it's a tension between wanting writers to get paid, wanting to be very realistic about what the conditions of the film industry are now as opposed to what we would like them to be, and also trying not to do what everything else in the film business does, which is to offload the risk onto the writer. So in terms of balancing all those three things, it's difficult.
Since 3 or 4 years, studios asked for me to write script without director, and it's a new life. And I find in this way to work with a studio, I discover a new respect of writing tape. You know, they want a script. They don't want a director with a screenwriter. They want a script, and they pay me to work, to have time to work, and I feel it. It's a very good experience. But it obliges me to change of genre, because no more social, boring little movie who nobody want to see. I am
the only kind I like.
Yeah, yeah. I am obliged to work on larger subject, you know, comedy or more spectacular movie, and it's very interesting for me. I learn a lot of things.
But you know, there are plenty of low-budget slasher movies that are made independently. You know, when I look in the New York Times on Friday when they have all the reviews, there's usually 4 or 5 independent films that involve pretty girls running through the woods getting slashed by somebody. I don't think that's, I think it's independent, but I don't think it's more intelligent. I think most of the intelligent films are independent, but I don't think most of the independent films are intelligent.
Yeah. You know, French cinema had this reputation, and we finished to lose our audience, even cinephile audience, you know. They are going to see a Korean movie, a Chinese movie, independent American movie, which are more better, much better, I think. And it's not a success for our way to think this outer independent cinema, I believe.
It's not necessarily an art film to me, an independent film, but it's a film where a certain amount of money, a script is developed and a certain amount of money is raised without going to a studio. And in that area, people have, by and large, been able to operate with more creative freedom than they do within the studio system, and they almost always make less money. If they have a hit, they usually, as quickly as they can, get into the studio system. There are very few, there are some writers and directors who maintain an entire career. I think Howard, actually, I don't want to repeat it, but you used to have a line about the studio executive who meets the star of Sundance. How did it go?
Yes. You've just made a film which is small and interesting. Can I give you some money to make one which is neither?
And this seems to be the career path of, I would say, the majority of people whose first films are independent films and do well. If they don't do well, they keep making independent films until they make one that does do well, and then they go into the studio system. But there are, of course, that's not entirely true. That's not true about Jim Jarmusch. It's not true of Todd Haynes. There are plenty of directors that want to keep making films that have a vision that would not really fit a studio template. Now, all of this started to change, I guess. I don't know, I say 20 years ago, that probably means it was 30 years ago. I don't know. If I say 5 years ago, it was 15 years ago. But some time ago, it started to change when there actually seemed to be a market for independent films. And so the studios started making independent films. And all the studios had independent film divisions of the studio, which of course meant they weren't all independent films. But I don't really know enough about the economics of the market. Probably somebody does here, but what I do know for sure is that's gone.
Studio system as it currently works, the idea is it's like serial monogamy. I mean, they just keep throwing writer after writer after writer after writer until a screenplay that only one person could have written becomes a screenplay that anybody could have written, and then they film it. In independent film, there's a lot better chance that you will see the work of one writer or a pair of writers working in very close collaboration, partly because there isn't money to just hire writer after writer after writer, and there isn't time to hire writer after writer after writer. And also, whereas large studio films, at least in the United States, are now far more about spectacle than about story, and more about story than about character, independent films tend to be more concentrated on what we think of as the writerly virtues, and those are the kinds of things that are dependent on voice, and exactly the kinds of things that get lost when you just keep piling writer after writer. So I think the reason that all of us up here do work in independent film, despite everything we've been saying, is that there's a much deeper satisfaction in working in those kind of arenas, and a much, much greater chance that if the film does get made, it will somehow resemble what you wrote.